I'm Jade Patel. I'm a Regional Intelligence Analyst here at Intelligence Fusion, and I'll be giving an update on the current situation in Sri Lanka. The current situation in Sri Lanka is that the foreign currency reserves have depleted, which has led to a financial and economic collapse. This means that the country is no longer able to pay their foreign debt. This has also led to struggles with kind of importing diesel and petrol, which is leading to fuel shortages throughout the country, which is also having a massive impact on food. So food's not being able to be delivered. Shipments also are struggling. I think at this moment in time, there is 90% of fuel stations that are inactive. Medication is also difficult to access in Sri Lanka. So specifically because of the fuel shortages, so kind of like emergency services aren't able to reach kind of out of reach areas, so they're not having as much access to healthcare. There was also a couple of months back some problems with medications. So medications was out of date but was still being used, which kind of led to a lot of them being destroyed. This is not saying that the healthcare that is available is failing, but it's having quite a negative impact nationwide. Due to the scarce amount of fuel available, transportation networks have had to be revised. So this is leading to kind of trains being cancelled or buses run intermittently. So that's also having a massive impact on supply chain because people are not able to access work and specifically education. So children are not able to get to school, specifically in rural and out of reach areas. And we were heavily reliant on school buses. I think fuel is probably the most important one right now because people, like, it's kind of like the emergency services that they heavily, like food heavily relies on it, kind of being able to store and kind of distribute it across the country. What we're kind of seeing now is long queues, long delays at fuel stations. And like I said before, 90% are inactive. So that really narrows it down to 10% where people are able to get fuel. So what we're kind of seeing is long queues, and there's actually been recorded deaths at these fuel stations and kind of all these different kind of crises that are going on. So we said like about the fuel, the food, and the transportation, education. It's all kind of leading to civil unrest. We are seeing a massive increase in tension between kind of like the government and the civilian population. So probably around March 2022, we saw a massive increase in anti-government protests, and they took different forms. So you kind of had the demonstrations, you had the roadblocks, there was quite a lot of strikes. So we saw that kind of like school teachers, people who work in different transportation was kind of all striking. A lot of the protest was heavily around getting the president to resign, and that was purely due to the kind of like they felt it was the economy had been mismanaged and that had led up to this point now. And there's also been a massive increase in kind of hoarding. So people are kind of hoarding food and also fuel. So there's been that kind of increase in criminal activity alongside the civil unrest. In April 2022, that's when we kind of saw the protests kind of getting worse. And this is when we kind of started seeing all the roadblocks like throughout the island. So they became a lot more violent quite quickly. We've seen a lot of arrests being made. We've also seen people hospitalised during these protests. So the government kind of used methods such as additional security in high-risk protest areas. So that could be fuel stations or like parliamentary buildings, predominantly in the capital city, but also like throughout the island. We also saw curfews being instated. I think that was a way to try and get people to be off the streets. These did not work. People still heavily protested on the streets despite the curfews. They announced public holidays at very short notice. In my kind of personal opinion for that, I do think that was more related to kind of like the schooling. So it took the pressure off trying to find fuel and kind of resources for schools and kind of focused on different areas. So there was the police used different methods such as tear gassing. Again, I think making the arrests also made it very likely that people got more violent. So you kind of had that, again, like a chain of events that were probably escalating the situation alongside the economy slowly collapsing. But it is probably worth mentioning within the last couple of months, so the food and fuel, because the demand's so high and the shipments are delayed, the inflation percentage is now at 57. So it's gone kind of from 30% in May to July 2022, it being 57% inflation. So after months of civil unrest throughout Sri Lanka, this escalated on July 9th, 2022, which we saw protesters storming the president's residence. This meant that the curfew that was implemented at the time was revoked, and this led the president to flee his residence and also offer a potential of his resignation. Aside from this kind of event, we also had a lot of protests going on. So there was the Gotabaya, there was kind of like university protests, all kind of within, I suppose, like a small area of this. So there was thousands upon thousands of people all kind of protesting on the streets. They then set fire to the Prime Minister's office and his kind of parliamentary building. So we saw, I suppose, what was quite violent already through demonstration escalate dramatically to take action directly against the government. As the president kind of fled the country, he was making sure that the kind of deals and also the shipments were still on track. However, I think the fact that there was so much kind of violence and demonstration that was going on, I think that kind of, I don't think people were really actively aware of that. It kind of left a situation where, like we said before, the shift of power, so it put a lot of pressure kind of on the Prime Minister and the ministers that were left in Sri Lanka. So they quite effectively, quite immediately started talks about how they are then going to get the protesters out of the parliamentary buildings and also what the future might look like for Sri Lanka. At the time of recording, there has been a curfew put onto Sri Lanka for approximately 24 hours. It's quite hard to say how effective this will be. We are still seeing demonstrations and protests. Everything's kind of in the air with kind of what's going on politically. And the army have sent kind of troops and tanks to the capital in hopes of kind of controlling the situation and trying to get back some of the parliamentary buildings. However, the Prime Minister has taken over as kind of like the acting president because he's still within Sri Lanka. The protesters have had kind of negotiations. They're still heavily want the resignation of the Prime Minister and the President. However, they have given back sections of the parliamentary buildings that they took in the takeover. But I do think if these kind of like demands are not met, then I think we're just going to see an increase of civil unrest, like kind of despite the military intervention. Over the coming weeks, there's a lot of political talks scheduled within Sri Lanka. The process, as far as I believe, will be the next steps would be to nominate potential new presidents, which then would get put to a public vote. However, I don't think a shift in government or a change in government is going to be suffice. I think there's going to be tensions there. I think it's going to be hard for any government to come in and kind of gain the trust of the civilians. That it's too far gone. Because you kind of have the situation where people are going without and the social conditions are decreasing. Well, kind of employment is also borderline, so people aren't able to get to work, so they're kind of losing out financially. So you kind of have this crossover where there might be supplies but people can't afford them, or there's not enough supplies and people are going without. So I think it's going to cause a bit of friction. Like we said before, tourism is a massive percent of their revenue. But we're seeing kind of even like this week, like the UK's kind of warning people not to go to Sri Lanka because of the kind of situation that they're in with the protests, the economy. So you kind of have this narrative where they've probably rely on that tourism, but are not getting it. And countries have been advised to kind of stay clear because of the kind of civil unrest that is happening. The kind of other side of that is even with the protests alone, but without the tourism, businesses are probably going to see kind of decrease. I mean, they're already kind of seeing that because they're not being able to either store food or even have the supplies to sell, and people aren't being able to afford it, or even people in rural areas are not able to reach it. So you kind of have this, I suppose, like a circle of events, and it's really hard to kind of find a way to break the chain. So people are still struggling despite this. So I think unless there is an a kind of like an increase in shipments or something on them lines, you're probably still going to have the protests that are going on, and people probably still will be without kind of like the essentials. Thank you for watching this insight. If you find our content interesting, please subscribe to our YouTube channel.